name's Hannah Mawdsley. I'm a PhD candidate at Queen Mary, University of London and the Imperial War Museum. Yes, it's a bit of an unusual one. Most PhDs come about through the student proposing a topic. My project was actually put together by my university, Queen Mary, University of London, and the Imperial War Museum. And then they advertised it like a job. And it was those personal stories that they sort of hinted at in the job advert that really caught my imagination. Saw this job advert, thought, God, that sounds absolutely fascinating. And I thought, I'll put in an application, and I was successful at interview. And it came about through the Imperial War Museum because the research department here had a copy of the book that was written by Richard Collier and published in 1974. But more importantly than that, they also had the original letters Richard Collier collected in 1972 and 1973 that he used a very small proportion of actually for his book. Mm-hmm. So all the original letters are here. I say all the letters. I did, once I'd started my PhD, I was comparing the book and the letters, and I realised that the multitude of Australian accounts that were in the book that Richard Collier had published were not in the collection here at the Imperial War Museum. So through the museum I was able to send a letter to the address that Richard Collier was living at 20 years ago when he died, and his letters were bequeathed to the museum. Not expecting anything to come of it, obviously, but got an email back saying, we're actually clearing the house for sale. This was the son of his partner in later life. They said, we're clearing the house for sale, but we haven't yet got to his archive, which was still there. Do you want to come and have a look? So, yes, was the answer.
Of course, yeah.
Hot-footed it down there and spent hours searching around this very sort of dusty, full, but remarkably well sort of ordered archive nonetheless. And after about 3 hours, finally managed to spot these lost Australian accounts in the corner. So very lucky. I feel very lucky to have been able to find them, and you know the sort of times involved in that, where you know if I'd done it a month or two later, perhaps they wouldn't have been there anymore.
Just serendipity.
Absolutely, yeah. They were meant to be found. Definitely, the range of stories that are in the Collier's letters was one of the first things that struck me. Some of them are absolutely heartrending and heartbreaking, but there's also ones that are very sort of factual about it, and also ones that actually there's quite a lot of morbid humour. Mm. So obviously these were written with a gap of 55 years between the recollection and the event, but nonetheless that range of emotion that was present in those letters was utterly fascinating. One of the most sort of poignant for me was a lady called Ethel Robson, who wrote to Collier and described how her mother and sister had both died of the flu, and she was about 9 years old at the time. And the double funeral was on Armistice Day. So she recalled the cortege going to the cemetery, and there was all this celebration and bells ringing and people cheering, and then suddenly people falling silent when they realised that it was her mother and sister's funeral, and that sort of very much made an impression on me. I think its impact is most seen in the subsequent scholarship. So you see Collier's letters referenced in most historians and works of other you know, slightly more popular history as well. You will inevitably see Collier's letters, usually from the book, I think, used in their work to illustrate the experience of the flu. So I think actually Collier's impact is more through his research rather than his book. His letters, he was asked to lend out his letters by other flu scholars. For example, Anthea Hislop, who's an Australian flu scholar, wrote to Collier in the mid-90s and asked if she could borrow the Australian letters, and was sort of saying how key these are, you know, the fact that he gathered these letters at a more timely point during the 20th century because more people were alive, and the value of the letters to particularly social historians for showing the value of you know, the Spanish flu in the narrative of that time.
Yeah, yeah.
I think Crosby is key to why this pandemic is remembered as the forgotten pandemic. He first published in 1976, Epidemic and Peace, and then in the wake of the AIDS epidemic, he republished as America's Forgotten Pandemic in the 80s. And I think that bit of probably savvy marketing in sort of the wake of a public fear of epidemic disease and infectious disease has very much defined how this pandemic was and continues to be remembered as forgotten, paradoxically. For me, the way that the flu is now being far more widely known and understood on its centenary is very much linked to the awareness of modern pandemics. I think the 2009 swine flu was very much key to that. And the sort of worldwide fear, the excessive amounts of Tamiflu that were manufactured and hoarded and stored. That emphasis on fear to drive action, I think, has been really important. And the revisiting of the Spanish flu as what can happen when an influenza virus reassorts or mutates into something that is highly infectious and potentially highly virulent as well. I think it's very much linked. For me, it's been hugely rewarding, actually. The interest, the broader interest, particularly in the media, has generated so many interesting approaches and even defining moments. That the flu community on Twitter, it throws up so many interesting things and new ways of approaching things. I think it only helps having more brains looking at a subject than fewer. Absolutely intentional. We were trying to do exactly that, an interdisciplinary podcast. Something a bit new, certainly the sort of combining of the science and the history in particular is a new model. And a lot of the credit does need to go to our brilliant producer, Melissa Fitzgerald, who is utterly fabulous. And it was very much a collaborative effort. Mark and I were the co-hosts, but it was definitely the three of us who were, debating and contributing. So, shout out to Melissa. A massive fan of interdisciplinary research anyway. I don't think you can fully understand one topic in isolation. Life doesn't happen in neat boxes, this is purely maths or this is purely geography. And I think the flu can't be understood just in one way. It doesn't fit in one box. It was global. It was, I consider it the first sort of universal global experience. Obviously it didn't hit everywhere, but within about a year, many people, most of the world potentially, were experiencing the same thing. And that is huge. I can't think of anything else that would have had that similar sort of effect. And it affected so many areas of life and so many different people that you can't look at it in just one way. The fact that there are still so many mysteries to do with the Spanish flu, that we don't understand really how to prevent it. We still don't have a universal flu vaccine. We still don't know the origin. There are still so many facets that we can't sort of simplify it by only looking at it in one way. We need to take as many different views at it as we can to try and drill down to some of the answers, which we can hopefully move forward with and protect ourselves in the future, potentially. Something that has come out of the media attention and some of the sort of commemorative activity that I know about going on around the world is the fact that even as this effort has been put into flu commemoration, the centenary of the armistice has been very much foremost in people's minds, and they've been very keen to either have the bulk of their stuff happening before or after the armistice, and not trying to compete with the armistice, which they have considered would drown out the flu effort. And it's a challenge because, as we know, the armistice caused mass celebrations and helped spread the flu in many places. I know that Auckland, for example, had they thought the war had been declared ended, and then they had a celebration, and then they were like, oh no, it's not ended. Oh no, it has ended, so have another celebration. And there's massive peaks in the mortality rate after that. So the armistice and the flu are absolutely wrapped up with each other. And yet, in terms of modern day centenary commemoration, there's an absolute thought among those people driving that we don't want them competing with each other. They're seeing them as a sort of antagonistic commemoration rather than part and parcel of the same thing. And I think we're seeing that in the war museums and that sort of thing as well, that they're seen as separate rather than mutually informing. I think with the flu, something that occupies my mind a lot is why we're interested in centenaries. But beyond that, I think with the flu, there are opportunities in the future because we don't have a universal vaccine for flu. And we still, as a globe, lose hundreds of thousands of people to flu every year. And that's even without pandemic flu. That's just sort of normal seasonal flu. That's an amazing death toll for something that we don't really think that much about. We will have another outbreak of epidemic or even pandemic flu. And I think when that happens, and even annually when flu season comes around, there are opportunities to revisit and reinforce what flu can do, what the chaos it can wreak on a global scale. Those are opportunities that we can utilise to try and drive change. It feels like medical research has been trying to tackle flu for the last 100 years, and there's still some way to go. I don't feel like I can answer that. Should anything be commemorated? There's always an agenda behind commemoration, and it depends where that comes from. I can't separate commemoration from the agenda behind it, and I would always be.
Is it because of the politics? Is it?
I think every commemoration is political, and it's not necessarily political in terms of politics, but it can be the politics of economic benefit, for example, the politics of social benefit, the politics of, for example, AIDS commemoration is very wrapped up with homosexuality and minority culture, and it's a sort of a mechanism through which a group can identify itself, as well as it's a springboard to fight with, as well as fight against. So even disease can be political in that way. So the question of whether something should be commemorated is a very problematic one, and I'm not sure I have an answer for you. Yeah, potentially. I think there's potentially colonial influences in terms of commemoration as well. I'm sure you'll have heard the example of Western Samoa, which was under New Zealand administration from 1914. You'll have heard the example of Western Samoa, which was under New Zealand administration from 1914. And they failed to quarantine the island, and about 90% of the population was infected, and around a quarter of the population died. And that was a hugely public colonial failing on behalf of the British Empire, not just New Zealand. And that's potentially one thing that's fed into this sort of lack of national recognition because it wasn't something that the dominant nations wanted to commemorate, this sort of failure, particularly New Zealand, which prided itself on having better relations with its indigenous population than many other countries. One of the things is absolutely still the mystery, the fact that this is still a topic that people are debating over, and that many people don't know about. It's quite inspiring to have that, oh, that's really interesting. How did I not know anything about that? Moment when you're talking to people about it, and particularly with sort of the more public history and the media stuff that has been going on. So yes, that sort of mystery aspect, that there's still so much to uncover. And for me, the personal stories are absolutely key. This is such a big topic. So many dead, global, it's too big. You can't picture something that big. You can't process it, you can't understand it, but it's those individual stories that allow you to understand what it must have been like. And then if you can somehow multiply all those individual personal stories on a sort of exponential scale, you can almost start to picture what the actual extent of this catastrophe was. So I think, despite it being so global, I think that the personal stories are not only so important, but what really makes it personal for me as a flu historian. To realise that every single person had an experience and a life, and family and friends and jobs, and yet this thing came along, and it could still happen today. That's a key thing as well. The fact that we could have another outbreak. How would we deal with it today? It's something that I've definitely thought about. There's a fascinating part of the Shobana Jaya Singh Dance Company's 1418 Now Commission is an Instagram campaign which charts millennials and how they would deal with an outbreak, and it charts certain individuals and how they'd go through it. It's really worth looking at.
Oh, wow.
Really, really good. It's on Instagram. I did a lot of media work last month. Nope, September. It's November now, isn't it? I did a lot of media work in October. I did a lot of media work in September, and what was remarkable was the number of people, having seen an article about me and my research on BBC News, and in some other print places as well. People got in touch with me. They found my university email online. They got in touch with me through LinkedIn. They sent, there were so many different ways that people got in touch, and they felt compelled to share their family flu stories. I gave a talk at the National Archives earlier in the year, and afterwards I had so many people come up and talk to me at the end saying, oh, and even during the talk I said, does anyone here know any family stories? Because I'm really interested in how much those narratives sort of perpetuated down the generations. So many people put their hands up, so many people had stories to contribute. So it's definitely something that, given the prompt, people are very keen to talk about and share. I would love to see a national or even international effort to collect such memories, sort of Collier in a digital age. I think one of the interesting things about the Spanish flu is the fact that we're not in a hugely better position today medically. They had something that they called a vaccine then, but it wasn't really a vaccine. They didn't know what viruses were, they couldn't see them, they didn't have the technology to see anything that small. And although today we have antibiotics which would help the secondary bacterial complications like pneumonia, which was the cause of many of the deaths during Spanish flu, we still don't have a vaccine. And actually, if something as infectious as Spanish flu happened today, with modern plane travel and that sort of thing, it would be around the world within a day or two. So yes, we would be able to develop vaccines, but only after a while, after we managed to develop something that actually matched that strain. Antiviral drugs like Tamiflu, there wouldn't be enough for everybody in that time frame. We would still be very reliant on the social interventions that ordinary people were using during the Spanish flu 100 years ago. So I think understanding what people were trying in the face of something they didn't understand 100 years ago, we would still very much be trying the same things. Any treatment we could think of, quarantine, isolation, wearing protective clothing, masks and that sort of thing. Those things that you see in so many of the letters from all around the world would still be very much what we relied on in the first instance. I have kept a diary since I was 17.
Oh, bravo.
On and off, but it's fascinating. And Dorothy's original diary is here at the Imperial War Museum. And reading her diary, it covers a number of years, but she's at a top from January 1918. And she talks about all sorts of different things, and parties, and the relationships with the medical officers and that sort of thing. And she's very real. She's very much, you can hear her voice through her own words, and the way she approaches the flu, the way she talks about her friend who catches it and she's really worried about, the way she describes nurses' funerals who've caught the flu and died. And then obviously she dies in March 1919, which we can't know for sure, but may have been related to flu itself. And it because you've got her own words in so much detail, and I almost identify with her as a diarist or a journalist. And then she dies, and also her commitment to her patients, the fact that she's out there, the war's over. She'd signed up to play her part in the war effort, and the war's over, but she's still there looking after sick troops, and ends up succumbing. It's a very poignant story, but certainly somebody that I identify with. And having gone to a top and seen her grave there in the military cemetery, just sort of seeing where she is, and it sort of brought it full circle and was very, very poignant and moving, actually. Yes, I go with John Oxford's étape theory, mainly because, and he'll tell you more about this himself in great detail, but the fact that there are instances of this purulent bronchitis in 1916 and 1917 in étape, the fact that it has so much movement in and out. You've got American doctors who go there and then go home pre-1918. It's a site with massive numbers of people living in close proximity. You've got piggeries, you've got domestic fowl, and it's a wildfowl migration route. It's a perfect storm situation for a virus to mutate and to become infectious, not only from animals to humans, but also between humans. So I fall down on that side. It might be because I've spoken most with John, and I'm convinced by him, but the Kansas origin theory doesn't appear to be that much followed even by John Barry anymore.
I sort of felt he was moving away from that.
Yeah.
We're not moving away, but everything was qualified now.
Yeah, yes, there's lots of qualification. So yeah, I think we may find samples that allow us to understand what the virus was in 1916, 1917, but I have no clue what my next move will be, actually. But I would certainly, I've got some ideas for public history books, which would very much be focusing around the flu and that sort of thing, which I'm quite enthused about, and I'd very much like to write. So even if I don't continue in flu in a formal capacity, then I would very much still be involved. In the UK, that's a tricky question because the curriculum very much determines what teachers are required to teach their students. So I would remove the onus from what teachers need to do differently to what the educational structure needs to potentially broaden its horizons in terms of what students are taught. So yeah, I would certainly broaden that from teachers. And in terms of the second part of your question, in terms of the unpacking and the investigatory nature of research by people like myself, I think teachers have quite a lot to do in terms of marking and teaching, and they've got quite hefty workloads. So I would like to see a teacher with the time to dedicate. So hopefully research by people like myself can be disseminated in forms that are easily used for teachers. And certainly that's something that the Florence Nightingale Spanish Flu exhibition has tried to create. It's created a schools resource pack that teachers can hopefully use fairly straightforwardly to tell a story that isn't always considered part of the First World War story. So I think it's actually not the onus on teachers, it's the onus on the educational establishment, and actually the onus on people like myself and other historians to enable teachers and facilitate teachers to tell the stories that I'm sure they want to, but don't have the resources or time to do so.
Good storytelling. Good storytelling. Anna Mawdsley, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Cheers.